Ingrid Thorvaldsdottir heard the roof beam crack at 3 in the morning, a sound like a bone breaking inside the chest of a giant. She was already awake, had been awake for hours, lying in the bed she had shared with her husband until 6 weeks ago, listening to the storm tear at the walls of the longhouse he had built, and wondering how long the timber would hold. Not long, as it turned out. The crack was followed by a groan, then a splintering crash that sent a cascade of snow and shattered wood into the center of the hall. The ridge beam, 40 feet of solid pine that Arvid had felled and shaped and raised with the help of 6 men, had snapped under the weight of the snow that had been accumulating for 9 days. Ingrid grabbed her cloak and her boots and ran. She was through the door and into the screaming darkness of the storm before the rest of the roof followed the ridge beam down, the entire structure folding inward like a house of sticks, burying everything she owned under a mountain of timber and snow and broken dreams. She stood in the wind, in the dark, in 30 degrees below zero, watching the longhouse die. And then she walked 200 paces south, to the low mound in the meadow that everyone in Havenfjord had told her was a waste of time, pulled open the heavy door that was set into the earth at an angle, descended into the ground, and closed the door behind her. The temperature inside was 58 degrees. The fire pit held a bed of coals from the evening's last burning. The walls were packed earth, 4 feet thick on every side, solid and silent and utterly indifferent to the storm that was destroying every timber building within 20 miles. Her buried longhouse had survived what the one above could not. Jarl Eirik Redbeard had been the first to call it madness. He had ridden out to Ingrid's farm in September, 2 weeks after Arvid's death, 2 weeks after the fever had taken him in the space of 3 days, leaving Ingrid alone with 60 acres, a herd of 30 goats, and a longhouse that needed constant repair. Eirik had come with an offer: 300 silver for the land, the livestock, and the fishing rights. A fair price, he said, more than fair, given the circumstances. A woman alone could not maintain a farm this size through winter. Everyone knew that. It was not cruelty to say so. It was arithmetic. Take the silver, Ingrid. Go south to your sister in Stavanger. Start fresh somewhere. The winter cannot reach you. Ingrid had looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who had already made her decision and was simply waiting for the conversation to end. The idea had come from Arvid himself, though he had not lived to see it built. In the last summer of his life, he had been complaining about the longhouse. The chinking was failing again. The wind found new gaps every winter. The roof timbers were sagging under years of accumulated weight from the turf that insulated them. We spend half the summer repairing the house, he had said one evening, sitting on the front step, watching the sunset over the fjord. And half the winter feeding the fire that keeps it warm. There must be a better way. Old Sigrid says in Iceland they build into the ground, Ingrid had offered. Half the house below the surface, half above. The earth holds the heat. Old Sigrid says many things. Old Sigrid survived 40 Icelandic winters in a turf house with walls 6 feet thick. She says she burned 8 cords a year. We burned 30. Arvid had not responded because the fever came 3 days later and the conversation was never finished. Old Sigrid was Sigrid Magnusdottir, a 68-year-old Icelandic woman who had come to Norway as a young bride and who carried in her memory the building techniques of a country where timber was so scarce that every structure was made of earth and stone and turf. She lived alone at the end of the fjord, in a cottage so small and so well insulated that she burned 4 cords of driftwood a year and was warm from October to May. Ingrid went to her the day after Eric's visit. "I need to build a house that I can heat alone," she said. "Underground, or mostly underground. Something the wind cannot reach and the snow cannot crush." Sigrid studied her for a long moment, her ice-blue eyes sharp in a face as weathered as driftwood. She found the spot in the meadow south of the Longhouse, a flat area where the soil was deep clay over gravel, with a gentle slope that would provide natural drainage away from any underground structure. "Here," she said, "dig here, 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, 6 feet deep. Leave a shelf of earth 2 feet wide around the entire perimeter for sleeping and sitting. Shore the walls with split timber if you have it, but the earth will hold on its own if the clay is good. Roof it with beams and turf, layered thick. Leave the entrance at the south end, angled downward so cold air cannot climb in. How long will this take? You have 7 weeks before the first hard frost. If you dig every day, you will finish. Stay with me, because what old Sigrid taught her is the reason Ingrid had a standing shelter at 58 degrees, when every timber longhouse in Havenfjord was flattened by the worst storm in 50 years, and the people who had called her shelter madness came begging to get inside. Ingrid dug. 7 weeks of digging from dawn until her arms could no longer lift the shovel, carving a rectangular pit into the meadow with the desperate energy of a woman who understood that the deadline was not negotiable. The topsoil came first, 18 inches of root-tangled earth. Then the clay, blue-gray and heavy, the same dense material that had been used to make pottery in the fjord settlements for generations. It held its shape when cut, forming walls as smooth and solid as stone. She dug the main chamber 30 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. She left the perimeter shelf as Sigrid had instructed, a bench of packed earth 2 feet wide and 18 inches above the floor that ran around 3 sides of the chamber. The shelf served as seating during the day and sleeping space at night, elevated above the cold air that sank to the floor. She shored the walls with split pine from trees Arvid had felled the previous autumn, setting the planks vertically against the earth and bracing them with horizontal timbers at the top and bottom. Between the planks and the earth, she packed dried moss, 6 inches thick, creating an insulating layer that trapped dead air and prevented moisture from seeping through. The roof was the heaviest work. She laid 8 beams across the 12-foot width, each beam a foot thick, resting on the top of the earthen walls. On top of the beams, she laid a deck of split planks, close-fitted and sealed with birch bark. On top of the planks, she laid 18 inches of turf blocks, cut from the meadow and stacked grass side down so the roots would bind them together as they settled. On top of the turf, she spread the excavated clay, 12 inches thick, and on top of the clay, she replaced the topsoil and scattered grass seed. The total weight of earth above the chamber was approximately 8 feet, counting the original ground level. 8 feet of packed earth and turf, heavier than any snowfall, stronger than any wind, insulating the space below with the patient, constant warmth of the ground itself. The entrance was a ramp at the south end, sloping down from ground level to the floor of the chamber, framed with timber and fitted with a door 4 inches thick, insulated with sheepskin and dried grass. A second opening at the north end served as a ventilation shaft, rising at an angle to the surface, capped with a wooden cover that kept rain and snow out, but let stale air escape. The fire pit was centered against the west wall, lined with river cobbles, with a chimney of beaten iron that rose through the turf roof and emerged at the surface disguised by a pile of stones. She moved the goats into the south end of the chamber, separated from the living space by a low wall of packed earth. 30 goats in an enclosed space generated substantial heat, their body warmth adding 10 to 15 degrees to the chamber's baseline temperature. By October 20th, the buried longhouse was complete. From above, it was invisible, a flat meadow with a gentle mound covered in autumn grass, indistinguishable from the natural terrain. The entrance ramp was hidden behind a fold in the slope, the door set back from the opening and screened by dead brush. Ingrid moved in on October 25th, transferring her belongings from the timber longhouse to the underground chamber. Her bed frame, her spinning wheel, her cooking pots, her stores of dried fish and barley and salted mutton. She stacked 10 cords of firewood along the east wall, less than a third of what the longhouse above required. The old longhouse stood empty, its door latched, its hearth cold. She left it standing because dismantling it would have taken time she did not have, and because part of her could not bear to destroy the house that Arvid had built with his own hands. Eirik Redbeard rode past in November and saw the empty longhouse. "She has left," he told his men. "Gone to Stavanger, most likely. The land is mine come spring." He did not look at the meadow behind the house. He did not notice the thin wisp of smoke that rose from between the stones of a pile that looked entirely natural. He did not imagine, because he could not imagine, that the widow was living 6 feet below the ground he was riding over. The storm arrived on December 8th. It came from the northwest, off the open sea, carrying winds that the old people would later say they had never experienced in their lifetimes. The first gusts hit at 70 miles per hour, strong enough to knock a man off his feet, strong enough to tear loose shutters from their hinges and send them spinning into the dark. The snow followed the wind, not falling, but flying horizontally, a solid wall of white that reduced visibility to the length of an arm. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. By midnight, it was 25 below and falling. The storm lasted 9 days. 9 days of wind that never dropped below 50 miles per hour. 9 days of snow that accumulated not in inches, but in feet. 9 days of cold so intense that water froze inside longhouses that had fires burning in them. The timber buildings of Havenfjord failed one by one. The wind found every gap in every wall and forced snow through it. The roof beams, designed for the weight of a normal winter's snow, groaned and cracked under drifts that piled 10 and 12 feet deep. The chinking between the logs, already weakened by years of freezing and thawing, disintegrated under the sustained assault of the wind. Eric's great hall lasted longer than most, its heavy construction buying time. But on the 5th day, the north wall began to bow inward, the timbers pushed by a drift that had climbed to the eaves. On the 7th day, 2 of the roof beams cracked. On the 9th day, the hall was uninhabitable, its fires producing more smoke than heat as the chimney backed up with impacted snow. 7 people died, 3 frozen in longhouses whose fires went out, 2 lost in the snow trying to reach the woodpile, 2 children who succumbed to the fever that cold and hunger brought. On the 10th day, when the storm finally broke and the survivors emerged into a landscape of white devastation, they looked across the ruined settlement and saw one thing that did not make sense. Smoke, rising from the meadow behind the empty longhouse. Steady, thin, patient smoke. They found the entrance on the 11th day, 14 of them, the most desperate of the survivors, following the smoke to the concealed ramp, finding the door, pulling it open. Ingrid was inside. The chamber was 58 degrees. The goats were alive. The fire pit held glowing coals. The stores of food lined the walls. The timber longhouse above was a ruin of broken beams and collapsed walls. The buried longhouse below was exactly as it had been the day Ingrid moved in, because the earth did not care about the wind, and the turf did not care about the snow, and 8 feet of packed clay and sod bore the weight of the drifts above with the same indifference it bore the weight of the sky. "Come in," Ingrid said. "All of you, there is room. If Norse reckoning has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of hidden preparation and quiet vindication." 14 people sheltered in Ingrid's buried longhouse for 8 days while the settlement above was dug out, and the surviving buildings were patched enough to provide minimal shelter. She fed them from her stores, rationing carefully, calculating that the dried fish and barley would hold if meals were kept to twice a day. The goats provided milk for the children and warmth for everyone, their body heat a constant presence that kept the chamber comfortable with minimal fire. When the crisis passed and the survivors returned to what remained of their homes, Eirik Redbeard stood before Ingrid in the ruins of his great hall and spoke the words that cost him more than any silver he had ever spent. "I told you to sell. I said you could not survive. I said the winter would take you." He looked at the ground, then at her, then at the meadow where her buried longhouse lay hidden and warm and intact. "Your shelter is the only one standing in Havenfjord. The only one." "It is not standing," Ingrid said. "It is lying down. That is why it survived." The distinction was not lost on anyone present. "Teach us," Eirik said. "Old Sigrid taught me. She is the one you should be asking." "Then bring her here, fund her, whatever she needs. I will pay for 10 buried longhouses before next winter, 20 if we can build them fast enough." Ingrid looked at the man who had tried to buy her land for a fraction of its worth, who had predicted her failure with the confidence of 20 years of being right about who survived and who did not. "My husband built the longhouse that collapsed last night," she said. "He built it with pride. He built it the way everyone builds: timber walls, turf roof, fire burning day and night. And it lasted 7 years before the wind took it." She paused. "I built the one underground in 7 weeks. It will last longer than anything Arvid built, longer than anything you have built, because the earth does not break the way timber breaks. The earth endures." Thank you for watching this story about Ingrid Thorvaldsdottir and the buried longhouse of Havenfjord. If it reminded you that the strongest shelter is not the tallest, but the deepest, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Norse Reckoning for more stories of those who built when others laughed, and survived when others could not. Old Sigrid came to Havenfjord that spring, walking the 30 miles from her cottage at the end of the fjord with the steady pace of a woman who had survived 40 Icelandic winters and saw no reason to hurry through a Norwegian spring. She inspected Ingrid's buried longhouse with the critical eye of a master builder, nodding at the drainage, frowning at the ventilation shaft, smiling at the sleeping shelf. "Your entrance angles too steeply," she said. "Widen it by a foot, and your chimney needs a cap that rotates with the wind, or a strong gust will push smoke back into the chamber." She supervised the construction of 8 buried longhouses that summer, each one an improvement on the last. By the following winter, 12 families in Havenfjord had underground shelters. The wood consumption of the settlement dropped by 2/3, The fear of winter, the annual dread that had defined life in the fjord for generations, began to loosen its grip. Old Sigrid died 2 years later, peacefully in the cottage at the end of the fjord, where she had lived alone for 30 years. Ingrid was with her at the end. "Just passing it on," the old woman said. "My mother taught me. I taught you. Now you teach the others. That is how the earth's knowledge survives." Ingrid taught others for the rest of her life. She remarried in the 4th year, a timber merchant named Brand Halvorsen, who had come to Havenfjord to sell building materials and had found, to his astonishment, that no one was buying timber for walls anymore. He stayed because the woman who had made his trade obsolete in one settlement was the most remarkable person he had ever met. They raised 3 children in the buried Longhouse, expanding it over the years into a complex of chambers that could shelter 40 people. The original timber longhouse above was never rebuilt. Its ruins slowly disappeared under grass and snow, the broken beams sinking into the earth that had outlasted them. Eirik Redbeard died 15 years after the Great Storm, having spent the second half of his life funding the construction of underground shelters throughout his territory. His legacy shifted from acquisition to preservation, from a man who profited from failure to a man who invested in the techniques that prevented it. The phrase Ingrid's Meadow entered the vocabulary of the Western fjords, meaning any shelter that is invisible from above but life-saving from within. When the winter storms came, as they always did, the families who had built below the surface gathered in their buried halls and told the story of the widow who had dug while her neighbors laughed, who had gone underground while her longhouse stood empty above, who had survived what no timber building could withstand because she had listened to an old Icelandic woman who understood that the earth endures when everything else fails. Ingrid Thorvaldsdottir. Halvorsdottir lived until the age of 71, dying in the expanded chamber she had first dug as a desperate widow 7 weeks before winter. They buried her in the meadow above the entrance, beside Arvid, the husband who had wondered if there was a better way and had not lived long enough to see his wife find it. Her gravestone carried a single line, carved by Brand with the care of a man who understood that some things need to be said simply. She built below, she survived above, she taught everyone between. What is the shelter that everyone thinks you do not have? And where have you buried your preparation?